Hello and welcome, my name is Ryan, I'm also known as Rm2kdev. In this video, I just wanted to have a sort of unscripted talk about print quality. Now the reason that I thought we would come to this point, and having a look at the 3D printer, you can probably see there's a few things that I've done to it to improve the print quality. I wanted to talk more or less about how we've come from, this type of print quality, which is, it's not that bad, but this is what came with the printer when I bought it, to making something that looks a little bit more like this. Now the print quality on this is far better. So I wanted to talk about how I've come to this point. Now I'm not saying this is the best print quality in the world, but this is just my sort of journey to this type of print quality. I guess the first thing, and you may have seen the video by now, was the upgrade from the Z-axis to the separated Z-axis wobble stopping parts. Now I've since printed a whole bunch more of these just in case these ones here do break, but we have some backups now just in case. But when the printer arrived out of the box, this is what the print quality was like, and it was it wasn't great, it wasn't fantastic, it wasn't too bad, but it certainly wasn't as good as it could have been. Then we upgraded the Z-axis, and I printed out another test cube, and this is sort of where we ended up. Now this wasn't too bad. We had some, I don't know what you would call those actually, maybe some shifted layers, just you can see sort of 3 of them, 1, 2, and 3, just down in there. But overall the print quality had gone up quite a lot. The surface quality was much better than it was before. The overall shape seems to be a little bit better, minus a few issues. Like I had this section at the bottom here that sort of protrudes out over near the finger that's moving there. That was the second attempt. At that point, I started to notice, I don't think I have an example. I started to notice some shifting layers, things like circles that weren't circular, for instance. If we take a look at, you can't really see it on this. This is a failed print, by the way, but there were some things like, if you look at that circle there, where it's kind of sort of squared off a little bit, that may be either a sort of a stringing or a skipped step when it was printing. But essentially I was starting to, actually you can see it better on the top. If you look at the circles, they're not round. You can see that they're actually kind of oval shaped. And the problem got worse and worse, and it kept getting worse until the point where prints just started, circles didn't look like circles at all. And I guess this is the point I wanted to make in this video. The first thing I noticed, well actually the first thing that happened is this was part of the Y tensioning assembly, which is this piece down here. It was separated in two. That goes in there. This piece separated from the base of its existing one. You can see it's quite thick, it comes in 2 pieces, but the top part separated from the bottom part. And I thought it was okay, but it actually wasn't. Essentially what was happening was this Y-axis belt was getting a bit loose. Now, I've got that tensioned. Someone mentioned it should be tensioned a bit like a bass guitar string, so that's the sort of tensioning that I've got on there. It's a little bit looser than a bass guitar, but gets the job done. Essentially, when that came loose, we started to notice these shifted layers, specifically in the Y-axis direction. That was the first thing that sort of set me on a path to improving that. So that side there, that's basically what I'm talking about there. You can sort of see it sort of jutting out. That was facing, when it printed, it was facing this way here. So as the Y-axis moved back and forwards, you can see the layer shifting happening in that piece there. That got a lot worse. It started happening on the fronts, and then it never happened on X and Y going this way, but it was making circles that were unusable, parts that weren't really straight or aligned properly. So first things first is I decided to reprint this part here. Now this is actually my own design because I couldn't find, you see this one here has like a curved corner. Mine doesn't have that. I just redesigned the part in Autodesk 123D, and I reprinted that with probably 60% infill, I think, because the part that it came with was not printed with much infill at all. So after having reprinted that part, put my Y-axis back together, everything was a lot better. The issue had sort of subsided. You're starting to notice a lot less of this, but it was still there. And I started to think to myself, well, what else could it be? It was only happening in the y-axis. So I grabbed the print bed and I gave it a little wobble, just back and forwards like this. And what I noticed was that the actual print bed itself was slipping. You could actually feel it as you pull on it forward and backwards like this. You could feel it sort of just moving back and forwards. And I wasn't certain. I mean, obviously this is my first printer, but I wasn't certain if that is how it should have been, how it came out of the box. I don't think it came like that. I didn't know to check, because being the first 3D printer, it's just the first thing I've ever had any experience with in this field. So I didn't know I was supposed to check that. So I had a look in here and I saw that it's held in place with zip ties. And I was thinking to myself, okay, a bit of slop in this Y plate must be acceptable, just purely because the linear bearings in there are held on with zip ties. So I'm thinking, you know, it can't be too tight. You know, it's not going to be perfect being held on with zip ties. But then I started to have a look at the screws. You can sort of see them in here. Just where I got my finger there, and I touched the screw, and immediately I noticed it was extremely wobbly. You could move it. It was loose. Essentially, it was loose. All the screws that hold these linear bearings in place were loose, and so I took the print bed off. I went around and, you know, I tightened up all those screws, all the ones on here. You can see them if I do that. There's 4 on that side there, and then there's 4. If I get that out of the way, there's 4. You can't see the last set. We'll go down a little further. Then there's 4 in this one here, and then there's also 2 in the middle that are side by side, and that's what's holding, that's what's connecting this to this base plate here. So I went through and I tightened up the 4 screws on each side, and then the 2 screws in the center to hold this in place. The next print that I did was this print, and ignoring the where's the top? This was the top layer. So the top layer is not fantastic, but the actual circles now are circular. There's no issues with the circles. The size and shape is far more accurate than it was before. Still got a little bit of stringing on the back. If you look through, you know, these ones here, you can see that little string just up in the left hole, not the one next to my finger, the one left of that. A little bit of stringing, unavoidable really without part cooling, which at the moment this printer doesn't have. But the overall surface quality, if I get that in the light, was much better. A vast improvement of surface quality. Size and shape, much better. In general, everything's much better. Even the overhangs, considering that there was no part cooling in there, that's pretty good. I get the light on that, you can actually see it if I now move gently. Really good surface. Quite surprising, considering in order to go basically from this kind of print quality to this kind of print quality, it's really just a case of making sure that your Z-axis doesn't have any wobbling, which we sorted out with these parts here, and ensuring that your X and Y-axis are stable and secure. That is the most important thing for print quality, I think, because the drastic effect that not having the Y-axis alone not securely in place had on my print quality goes to show that just simply tightening the screws, and don't over tighten them because you don't want to strip anything. You don't want to like break the screws or strip the nuts that are, you know, holding these in place. You just want it nice and snug so that it's not going to vibrate itself loose. And I have a feeling that that's what happened. Essentially, throughout using this printer, the screws had vibrated themselves loose. And so that sent me down another path again, thinking like, okay, well, if that's what's happened to my Y-axis, I wonder what's happened to my X-axis. And so I've gone about, you know, tightening up all the screws along the X-axis, making sure that everything is clamped down, you know, over here, making sure that all these things here are tightened. I talked about this end stop for the Z-axis before, but essentially, you know, that vibrated itself loose, and that wasn't good, and, you know, these things over here had vibrated loose. So just making sure everything's tightened down. These are still a little bit loose. You can actually see a little bit of, oh, sorry, it'll help if I focused on it. That thing there, actually I tightened that up a little bit. Oh, there you go, perfect example right there. The Z-axis end stop is loose. You know, so tightening that down, I can undo these bolts here. I'm actually twisting that with my finger, you can see. that twisting down there. So that's going to vibrate itself loose shortly. I'm going to have to tighten that up. But moral of the story, make sure everything is tightened on the printer. If it is tightened down to a point where it's not going to vibrate itself loose and it's not so tight that you're warping things or breaking things, that is the point where everything should be tightened to. Make sure that your belts are tensioned correctly. People say, you know, just looking online, as I've said, this is my first 3D printer, so when people say tighten the belts appropriately, I don't know what that means, and I don't have the mechanism at home to make a belt appropriately tightened. There's no way that I can quantify what tightness this belt is at my home that I know of, you know. There might be some specialist tool, but I don't have that tool. So, you know, the way that it was explained on a YouTube video is sort of just tighten it until it's about as tight as, not as tight as a bass guitar string, you want it loose. I'm going to call this a drop C guitar string. But essentially, you want that pretty loose, but you also don't want to have it like floppy and flapping around. You want it to maintain its shape, and you don't want it to be, you know, so tight that it's just pulling on the motor. You want to have a little bit of motion in this part here. You want to allow it to wiggle. You know, just tight enough that it's producing a tone. If it's not tight enough, it's not gonna make any sounds. It's just gonna flop, and you'll most likely see that you're having issues like that, where it's actually less so like that, more so like this, where it's skipping layers. Sorry, skipping steps, and even in this case here, it's not necessarily just about skipping steps, but it's also about overshoot. So as the y-axis moves back this way and then the motor stops, because of the amount of play in this bed, the bed would keep going. So you'd end up with a sort of overshooting of where it needs to be. So that's basically everything that I've done to achieve up to this level of print quality. The final step, this is something that I've printed more recently. And again, this is, like I said earlier, this is not the standard of print quality, but this is pretty darn good. If I get the light on that. This was essentially upgrading the firmware on my board. So the board came preloaded with Marlin 1.0.0, and at the moment, I believe at the time of recording this video, they are up to version 1.1.0 RC8, which is like release candidate 8. So I upgraded the board to 1.1.0 RC8 and put all my settings back in as they should be. Interestingly, I increased the speed of everything. So the default settings in Marlin are much faster than the default settings in the firmware that this board came with. So a lot of those speed settings I just left at their defaults. This was printed in 0.2 millimeter layer height, 0.2 millimeter layer height, yep. And you know, the surface finish on that, I mean, the top surface and bottom surface are, you know, pretty average. I still have calibration to go as far as getting these. This is also printed without a hot bed, so you know, I get issues like what you're seeing there. But the top surfaces I'm less I'm less interested in. More so, I'm interested in these side surfaces, because this is the type of quality that an object is going to get as it builds up. You know, the top surface can be sanded down. You can also increase the number of layers so that you don't have this sort of texture. You can change all those things through parameters. But the actual accuracy of these corners side to side, making sure that the corners don't have sort of this bleeding edge to them. If you compare that corner, let's compare this corner here. There you go, you can probably get a better idea of that corner. If you can't, I'll just run my thumb over it. My finger. You can hear the layers in that corner. Now if I do the same thing with this piece here, it's much smoother. Okay, it sounds exactly the same, but you get the idea. If we look at the corner, I'm trying to get a good picture for you. It's almost perfect. The edge is basically perfect. That was a result of upgrading the firmware. I'm guessing it's a result of improved algorithms for moving these parts. I don't know. I'm just saying that we are now, you know, potentially 15 to 20 versions ahead of version 1.0, which I'm not sure even when that came out. This is well before I got into 3D printing, but I'm assuming it's quite old. And so upgrading to the latest firmware obviously comes with some advantages. Maybe it's got some enhanced accuracy in driving the stepper motors. Maybe it has enhanced accuracy in understanding how the belts will resonate as it moves and counteracting that with jerk settings and all those sort of things that are well beyond the scope of this video. Upgrading the firmware has certainly led to some serious improvements in print quality. So those are the few things that I've done so far to improve the print quality on this machine. The next things that I'll be looking at are going to be upgrading this to a Bowden type extruder. I have the parts on the way already. I'll be moving the extrusion mechanism probably up to this top corner or even that top corner, and then, you know, having the Teflon tube coming down to the hot end. Also upgrading to an E3D print head just to suit that Bowden system, and of course I'm going to be installing a print cooling fan. At the moment my print cooling fan is this little guy over here. Does the job, as you can see. If you look through those holes, this was printed without supports, so this section down here is a little bit nasty, to say the least. It's not the best quality on the underside there when we get right up on it, but you know, like I said, the sides and top are fine. But when you look through the holes, there's actually no stringing, which is what I'm most interested. Most interested in the fact that there's no stringing. That's a really good sign. Once we get some cooling on this, that type of effect there won't be happening. And I'm aware that we've got some bed issues. I've been printing on this bed so much that, you know, I've started to get holes in it and scratches. I need to replace the surface. Partially this is from the bed, partially this is poor calibration, but we're certainly getting there for as far as the top surface goes. I'll get right up on that so you can see the individual layers. It's pretty good. Sides are the best, as I've said. 0.2mm layer height. Cura print took 3 hours, I believe. 25% infill. It's definitely a lot better than it was. Anyway, I'm rambling now, but we also had a little print test cube thing where you can see the edges. I just wanted something to pull out of the printer to actually see what was happening with that. The top surface obviously was drooping because I had no infill and no part cooling fan, and I squished it with my thumb. That's why it's got this little dent here, but nonetheless, it's a good indicator of the improvements that we've made. And as I said, the upgrading of this firmware board. Now, this is a topic of interest. I will be making a dedicated video on this subject, but this board is not an official G-Tech GT2560 board. I'm going to keep poking at it with my finger because I want to make that point very clear. You cannot upgrade the firmware on these using the same settings that you expect to upgrade the firmware with an GT2560 official board, because the official boards use a different type of bootloader on the ATmega 2560 chip, so you can't program it with the Arduino IDE without making some serious modifications. Now, having looked online, thousands and thousands of people have this issue. I struggled with it for hours. Absolute hours, until I got a little bit smart about it and started looking not just at this board but also at the Arduino ATmega 2560 and the Chinese clones of that board that exist, and the problems that people have had in those communities trying to update sketches to those boards. So rest assured, anyone who has this board and is unable to update the firmware, I have figured it out. I do know how to do it, and I am working on a video to explain it, which will be coming out extremely shortly, so that you too will be able to update your printer to the latest firmware. Also, I will just turn it on so you can see. There you go. So we're definitely on the latest firmware. Turn it off now. But you know, just to prove the point that, you know, this is a CTC. I've since figured out and learnt that this is a brand and not just an identification number, but it is a CTC with the generic Chinese board that has been upgraded to the latest version of Marlin and is working successfully. There's a little bit of configuration involved. I'll go into all of that in another video. It may not be the next video. It may most likely be the video after this one. But we'll see how that goes. For now, I have to, you know, record it on my Mac and on my PC and get that sorted. Anyway, hope you've enjoyed this video. If you have, please go ahead and leave a like on the video. This 3D printing stuff is extremely interesting to me. I'm finding this really fascinating, the ability to reproduce parts and throw them all over the room. But the fact that it can reproduce itself, it can make its own parts, as you probably figured out by now, this part that I've been demonstrating is actually a replacement for this carriage. I'm not that I'll be replacing it, I just wanted to have backups in case I did break anything during my modification adventure. But as I said, thank you for watching. Please leave a like. You have no idea how much that really helps this channel grow. I really appreciate it when you guys do comment and join in and make suggestions and ask questions. I do try and answer everything. So go ahead and, if you have any questions, feel free to ask me. I will try my best to get back to you. And yeah, enjoy your day. Hope you have a good one. Take care, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.